So we've talked about the elements of composition, rule of thirds, bird's eye, worm's eye, all that stuff. Now we're going to move on to how a camera works and how you use one of these. See, I'm not used to the camera. How one of these cameras works, and we're going to talk about basically the first thing you need to know is you need to know three basic rules in a camera: the ISO, which is sensitivity to light; shutter speed, with how fast the shutter opens; and then aperture is how wide the shutter opens. And all those things are kind of mixed together. Before I begin, what you need to do is make sure that your camera is in manual. And there's an M on the dial that you can see right here. That means everything is manually done. You're going to mess with the ISO, you're going to mess with the aperture, you're going to mess with the shutter speed. Anything else, like a full auto, will turn on a flash when you don't want it, and you can't manipulate, not so much the flash, but other things, but you can't manipulate the photo the way you want to. So I want you guys to be shooting in all manual, which is the M on the dial. So when setting the ISO, you want to look here and you want to press this button here on the camera. And by using the dial here right above the button, you can, if you just press ISO, you can dial it all the way down to 100, or it can go all the way up to 12,800. 12,800 is a little too much. That's for very, very low light if you absolutely have to get the photo. The problem is, the trade-off is the pictures get grainier. And you don't want that sometimes because you want them to be. So you got to find a balance between sensitivity to light. Honestly, ISO is the last thing that I set. So the next thing I mess with is shutter speed, and I look at shutter speed. Going in, I know when I need a high shutter speed. Shutter speed is how fast the sensors, or how fast light gets into the sensors. So the higher the shutter speed, you can stop the action better. It doesn't get as blurry. So if you go to a basketball game and the ball is releasing from the point guard's hands, and the ball is blurry or the hand is blurry, that means your shutter speed's not high enough because it's not capturing it quickly enough. Okay, so the higher the shutter speed, you're looking for sports. For if you're at a concert and they're drumming and you want to catch the drumsticks without the blur, something like that, that's where you want to use a high shutter speed. And the shutter speed on here, remember, we're in all M, and the shutter speed is, if you hit, especially on this camera, if you hit the Q button and then you press the fraction here, 1/500, that means it's going to open for 1/500th of a second. That's your shutter speed. The higher the number, the faster your shutter speed. Okay, so the higher the number, the faster the shutter speed. The lower the number, the lower the shutter speed. So the faster it goes, it opens a lot quicker, and it opens and shuts a lot quicker. Okay, but if you lengthen the shutter speed, or if you have it go a little bit longer, it opens like that. Okay. Now the advantage to that in a sports setting is it just quickly lets in some light and you can freeze the action. If I'm in a classroom setting and I'm watching a teacher teach, I maybe bring down my shutter speed, or I don't really need to worry about that so much. Now the advantage of having a high shutter speed is you get to stop the action. The disadvantage is you don't get a lot of light in there because the shutter isn't open that long enough to get that kind of light. Okay. So you've got to find a balance, right? So you got to find a balance between a high shutter speed and getting enough light in there, and then you got to mix with ISO. Well, anyway, shutter speed, and the next thing I'm going to talk about, aperture, are joined. Now, aperture is the size of the opening. If I can do this right here, the size of the opening in the lens. So and basically put is the smaller the number. So let me backtrack. You can look at your aperture here. You can look at your aperture here, and you press the Q button again. And this is nice because it's a touch screen. If you touch the F part, these are called f-stops. Aperture and f-stops are basically the same thing. And you can dial it by using this dial here. You see where my finger is. If it goes all the way up, this one goes all the way up to f22. So the larger the number, the F it basically determines the size of how much light is getting in here. So the bigger the number, the smaller the hole. As you get the smaller the number, you get the bigger. So you let more light in, right? So you've got to determine. So like I said, it's kind of counterintuitive. So the bigger the number, the smaller the opening. But then the smaller the number, you get the bigger the opening. So you've got to mix that with shutter speed, and you got to mix that with the aperture. So if I have a fast shutter speed, I need to let, even though it's going to be up for a short amount of time, I need to let a lot of light in. Okay, so if I have a high shutter speed, I have to have a wide open. I have a more open aperture, so I have to have a smaller. I have to have a smaller number. Okay, so you got to find that. So if you let's see if I can do this in the camera. So if you raise your shutter speed, you've got to lower your aperture, and if you raise your aperture, you got to lower your shutter speed. The advantage of having a wider aperture is you let in a lot of light, but then your depth of field. Remember we talked about selective focus. Okay, and selective focus is where everything's blurry in the background, but your subject is perfectly in focus. So the wider the aperture, you have a wider depth of field, and you get that effect. So you gotta have to mess with the settings. So wide aperture, shutter speed, they're like this. The ISO comes in is how much sensitivity when you have this balance, how sensitive that light is going to be when it hits the sensor. What I want you to do now is go into modules, and you'll notice that I've kind of blown up modules here and kind of separated out. But I want you to go into camera settings. This is what you're going to do for class today. And I want you to click on, first of all, I want you to click on camera settings tutorial. And there's a guy there that does a really good job and shows you good examples of using shutter speed, high shutter speed, low shutter speed, aperture, and how that works. So I want you to go through that. I want you to look at that. Then I want you to click on camera settings practice. Okay, so you're on one of the Macs in the lab, and you see this little girl. And what I want you to do is I want you to mess with the ISO and the aperture and the shutter, and work with the, is it overcast? Is it bright indoors? And I want you to mess with these. And I want you to stop that pinwheel. So you're going to mess with what? Your shutter. You need a high shutter. Notice how the aperture already kind of slides, like I told you, it's kind of corresponding. I want you to go for all manual. So I want you to mess with it. So let's just try this. It's pretty good. She's outside, and I'll show you why that worked. She's outside, so the ISO can be down. You need to freeze that pinwheel, so a high shutter speed and a low aperture. Okay. You don't need to worry about focal length. You can mess with distance if you want. You can mess with this. If I make it bright indoors, then I'll need to move up my ISO, right? And let's see what happens. It's still dark. So why is it dark? My ISO needs to be up. Maybe I bring down my shutter speed and let it go a little bit. So you see what I'm saying? You kind of have to mess around. And you're getting there. Anyway, I want you to mess around with that. I want you to kind of experiment. I want you to get good shots both indoors and outdoors, and it's kind of your chance to experiment. And then on Friday, we'll get to play, we'll get to test your camera skills in class.